Allegra Spender, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with the government's changes to the Stage 3 tax cuts. Have those revisions made them fairer for people on low or moderate incomes?
Look, I think that Australian families right now are having a very hard time. And this is across the country, and particularly those on low and moderate income. So certainly I think the changes the government have delivered relief to that. But I don't think it is reform, and I also want to flag, because a lot of people in my community were expecting some other changes, that there are some people out there who were also expecting those changes who no longer have them, and that's going to mean some hard choices for them as well.
So to be clear, you just said that's not reform. So just to be clear, was breaking that promise a brave decision to help poorer Australians, or just politics as usual?
Look, I think that they needed to do something on cost of living, and I think that was really important. But frankly, my biggest challenge and the biggest concern I had with them was really their decision back when they got elected, which is that they said, we're not going to touch tax. We're not going to touch some of the most important levers that as a government we have. And so, they really, locked themselves in terms of what they can do in terms of delivering, reform, but also in terms of delivering cost of living relief.
In a way, it does go to the central question. Why do you think the two major parties seem to lack courage for the kind of wholesale tax reform that you're talking about? Why?
Well, I think they've been extremely effective at wedging each other, for decades, honestly. And I also don't. I know that tax reform is difficult.
Yes.
But I also think that as a country, we do have, the short-term challenges that Australian families are feeling right now. But we also have some really big long-term challenges, and they're about intergenerational equity, helping young people have the same quality of life and opportunities that other people did. I think it's about economic growth and productivity. We're on the go-slow rein at the moment, and we have to change. And then finally, it's about this climate transition. We need to look at tax reform to deal with those most effectively.
So how do we get there? Because it's the voters, of course. It's not just about wedging each other. It's about wedging each other because of the voters. In tax, there's always, or almost always, winners and losers. So politicians can mobilise losers at any time in a scare campaign. So that seems to work against politicians taking risks. So how do you get around that? How do you change that?
Look, again, it's not been easy, but I think let's look at what people have done in the past. I think if we look at Howard and Costello, we look at Hawke and Keating, what are the elements that they drove? And it was, I think, three key things. Firstly, they focused on what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and they had that laser-like focus on the problem. Secondly, they built diverse coalitions. They tried to bring as many people into the tent around that problem as possible. You think about Howard and Costello, one of the key supporters of the GST reforms was the Australian Council of Social Services. Not a name you would normally associate, with a coalition necessarily. But, the government at the day recognised that you had to bring everybody in. You couldn't just pick the normal suspects. And then finally, I think what they all did was they put together packages that meant that there were some winners, there were some losers, but there were trade-offs. No one got everything that they wanted, but I felt that created more robustness. It enabled it to stick, and it meant that, we move away from that sort of pendulum politics, which is all over Nemesis right now, which is, it's in this week, it's out next week when the new government comes in.
So come back to GST, because you raised that coalition that was put together at the time, as you say rightly, including ACOS, not an obvious coalition. But at the same time, you've made a very strong argument that our politics depends too much on income tax, which immediately throws the focus back onto the GST. But in this period of politics, certainly the current government has ruled out a change. It would be risky for them to put it back on the table.
Well, I think
how do you create the coalition that you've just referred to in this era?
So I think two things. Firstly, I just want to talk about the government's position. The government has broken a promise, right? And so the question is, do they just stick with that for the next election? If they go to the next election and say, we're not going to do anything, we're not going to touch tax, no one's going to believe them.
So they've lost that opportunity.
Well, then that means they have the opportunity for reform.
Yes.
This is the opportunity for them to go brave and say, okay, we're putting tax back on the table and we'll build that consensus. What I've been doing, for example, is getting together academics, business groups, groups, the ACTU, the ACOS again, the environmental groups, and said, where is your common ground? And I think this is what we need to do as a country. People are looking for common ground and not this sort of political wedging, but saying we've got some serious long-term issues, let's work out where we can fix them.
And would you be prepared to go out and campaign on the GST, for example?
If that is part of that package that I put together, absolutely. What I'm going to do is release a green paper sort of towards the mid-year or just after. And my goal is to take that to my community. I'm going to have different views from the community coming to me. But I think that you have to be open and willing to have those conversations, and not just dismiss. I'm not saying that GST will definitely be in it,
no, I understand
but I'm
that.
Certainly considering it in the options, and I think we should be.
And today, when pushed, because it wasn't included in the main body of your speech today, but when asked a question, you did say that negative gearing should also be on the table.
Yeah.
Again, anyone who has suggested that recently has faced a huge backlash. How would you convince the major parties then to take a risk on that?
Well, I think the first question is, what's the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah.
And I think, the thing that one of the things I'm most worried about is intergenerational equity. Young people are being locked out of housing. Sydney is the second most unaffordable place in the world to live. And at the same time, what we're seeing is that older generations, households over 65, are growing their wealth, and our younger generations are not.
But just on that case, those people are people who, as you say, with the stage 3 tax cuts, have planned for this period of their life.
Yeah, of course they have. And so how you do this, how you build consensus, how you build trade-offs, it's complicated and it's hard. But I think that I have in Wentworth people from all views, young, old, in the middle, who are saying basically housing is the biggest issue facing our young people. Now, tax is not the only issue and not the only way to solve it, but it is absolutely one way to address it, and we need to have that one on the table. And so, but again, it comes back to building a coalition, and it's the trade-offs. Maybe there'll be a package with GST. Maybe there's a different way of making housing more affordable that's not about negative.
How would you bring ACOS into a coalition if you wanted to raise the GST? Obviously, it's people on lower incomes who bear the brunt of that. How do you bring ACOS into a coalition to support raising the GST now?
Well, look, again,
ACOS,
I'm not,
example.
You can ask ACOS
Yes,
what they
of course.
feel about these different things.
But whoever it is you need to make that coalition work.
But I think the point is that if you're looking at any tax, whether it's GST or others, it comes back to what is the problem you're trying to solve? Do you have unity around that? What's the evidence on that? And what do they want? Where you look at, the GST, for example, with Howard and ACOS, the reason why they supported it was partly because it was a stable source of income, and partly because, most vulnerable people were really significantly compensated. So there was a change in tax, but they were okay. And that's why I think, again, you've got to come back to packages. In any sort of tax reform, if you just shoot at one thing, then you don't have the opportunity to balance the winners and losers and create a package that actually, addresses vulnerable people, but also addresses driving productivity.
You said today that you expect that your green paper, which is what you're proposing to put these ideas out there, that it would already face a backlash from people. There would be a scare campaign against you. You're taking that on. So how do you actually build the coalition that you're talking about? Because you need a coalition of politicians and public figures to back you if you're going to get anywhere with this. And well, to be honest, I also need a coalition of people in my community. So I think it is, it's bringing those people together, it's listening, it's understanding their objections and seeing what the evidence is, because when people object, it's often for good reason, and you can see if you find that compromise. But then the other piece is actually going to the community and saying, well, what do you think? We will have a wide variety of views in Wentworth, but I think if you can actually have that conversation and come back to what is the problem you're trying to solve, we have the best chance. Just briefly, when you came in before, you said that you'd found Question Time disappointing when you went into federal politics. Better, yes or no? No, I'd still say no. I think actually there was a bit of discussion among some of the crossbench today on this very question, and we just want to say to the government, when someone asks a question, can you please answer it? We think that's a reasonable answer. Ask for Question Time. Let's come back to that reform. Allegra Spender, thank you very much indeed for coming in tonight. Thanks so much, Sarah.